I don't think anything can really rectify Britain's standing on the global stage here. You're not going to see Sir Keir sending military troops. I really don't like Farage. Well, he's just a very despicable person.
We can now come to the UK elections. So these elections were suddenly called out of the blue by Sunak. So I want to start by talking about uh, your opinion about the Labour Party. Do you think it can resurrect Britain's standing on the global stage?
I don't think anything can really rectify Britain's standing on the global stage after Brexit. I think Brexit was one of the most singular, disastrous political decisions any country anywhere has ever made. I am staunchly pro-Remain, not because I think Europe's the best thing ever, but because you don't resolve an issue by leaving it. You'd be better off staying in and changing it from within, right? You have more influence. And the UK was so unprecedented in its unique position. We had a veto, the only one. We had an opt-out clause. We had a rebate system that was designed and established by Margaret Thatcher, who's not exactly you would consider to be the most, she's Eurosceptic, Tory, right? But she established the rebate system. So for every X amount of money, we got back in funding. And you can see how bad the withdrawal from Europe has been, because the overall economic balance across the UK has gotten so much worse. Rural areas, northern parts of the UK, anywhere basically not London, has seen a huge reduction in funding because the EU was giving us money. We were receiving support from European programs to invest in city centres for culture, for education, for various arts, things that were enabling the cities to be more alive. And so many of the cities have become shells, husks of their former significance because they don't have the money. There's a disturbing trend that is developing, actually, that I didn't realize because I don't really follow too much in domestic UK politics, at least on a regional level. I look at the national, but more and more British councils are going bankrupt. The Birmingham Council, City Council, Birmingham, second largest city in the country, 1.5 million people roughly, I think, was bankrupt. How? And that's because of Brexit being a combination also with austerity, also being a combination of not really any growth across the UK and Europe combined because of 2008 and the Euro crisis of 2012, having all these, rise of populism as well. Basically, we're in a really tough way, and it's not going to just be, the reason I'm saying all this is because it's not going to be just down to one party that can restore the UK's international standing. The UK is not going to disappear suddenly and be completely irrelevant in the sense of we've got nuclear weapons, although I find that a rather bizarre metric to use, or sort of irrelevant because we can blow you up. But, the UK is on the Security Council. We do have a good ease of doing business index by the World Bank, always puts the UK very high because there's a lot of entrepreneurialism. People come here because the ease of starting a business or developing sorts of things is still pretty good relative to other countries in Europe, for example. But they start the business, but then they'll probably shift it elsewhere. More favorable tax laws, more favorable opportunity to hire. You've got 500 million people in Europe, right? So the UK does have things to offer, but right now the Labour Party is facing a very difficult situation. I think that Sir Keir Starmer is probably, this isn't me a flat rate sort of endorsement of him, but I think he's probably, as a personality, the kind of thing that the country needs now. We've had 6-7 years of uncharacteristically political disruption and uncertainty. The UK, whether you like the politics or not, has often been seen relative to other countries like France, for example, as a consistently stable place. We'd have an election, we would vote, we might not be overly happy with that, but we would have a party and it would shift. And then, we would be seen from a market's perspective, a business perspective, a relatively safe haven. the monetary policy, the Bank of England has its independency and it's not overly politicized. That's changed in the past few years, again, for various reasons, but the infighting and populism that has really emerged in the Conservative Party has completely undermined that. So I think at this point, the British public just wants a safe pair of hands, who might be a little bit boring because it's a bit boring, to, just take the reins, try to get the country under control. The Labour Party are really heavily pushing a mantra of fiscal responsibility. So they want to tax. They are going to raise taxes, but not necessarily in all the most, not just income tax, but in certain areas. And because we have a massive deficit, we have a funding problem. And so I think that they're going to be primarily focusing on our own domestic issues whilst trying to be seen again as returning to being a proactive international player. The Labour Party have made it very clear they want to seek a ceasefire in Israel and Gaza, for example. Now the Israelis are launching a potential offensive in Lebanon. Now I'm not sure how much that's going to make a difference. But yeah, I think the Labour Party will restore some faith in Britain when they win, particularly again from a markets perspective. I think that will do benefit. I think you will see a growth again in FDI and in business activity here, which will probably help to begin to alleviate and improve the financial standing of the UK, which in itself will trickle down or roll over a snowball into it being able to be more influential again in certain areas internationally. But at the moment, the UK is in a bit of a tough place. The past 10 years, it's been trying to find itself. Who is the UK? What do we want to represent? What do we want to be seen as a leader in the international system? And all of this obviously plays into the broader geopolitical, multipolar world that we seem to be in. De-dollarization, BRICS. How is Britain going to navigate that? Is it going to try to leverage its influence in things like the AUKUS deal, with Australia and America? Will it try to deepen its ties with Europe vis-a-vis Ukraine? There's definitely a few areas that the British can come back in, but I think the primary focus of the Labour Party will be domestic and economic.
So how similar or different do you think Sir Keir Starmer is from Tony Blair? Because they both try to bring Labour to the centre.
Well, Sir Keir doesn't have the charisma of Blair. Blair is a very good public statesman. He was very charismatic. He still is. He's got a certain character that Sir Keir doesn't. I think Sir Keir is a safe pair of hands, whilst Blair was a bit more of a visionary, perhaps, in the sense of, Blair did quite a few notable things. He introduced some fantastic infrastructure projects. He initiated the minimum wage. He did some pretty, at the time for the 90s, some pretty radical things. And I don't think we're going to be seeing such radicalism under Sir Keir. But they are very similar in the sense of, Sir Keir has made some pretty obviously ruthless decisions. He has evicted a large proportion of the left of the centre of the Labour Party, which in my opinion is good. We saw how disastrous Corbyn was for Labour in 2019. And I think that they're similar in their sorts of certain policies. Again, you also have to consider the broader context because we're not in the 90s. The world is far more fragmented. The world hasn't just seen the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the West is in a high flying, the US is dominant unquestionably. We've got China, we've got India, we've got a lot more actors that are much more willing to exert their interests. So Sir Keir is going to be navigating a world which is very different to what Blair did. But equally speaking, I don't think Sir Keir is going to start any illegal wars, for example, right? I liked Blair. I mean, I was 6, but I liked Blair in his first term, right? Reading political history or whatever, reading a bit about it in the past. I liked Blair in his first term. I thought he did some fantastic things. As soon as he won the second election and started getting involved in Afghanistan and Iraq, then it's completely changed. But you're not going to see that with Sir Keir. You're not going to see Sir Keir sending military troops down to Israel to stop the war, right? That's just not happening. So there are similarities in what they'll probably do domestically with policy. in terms of its economics, again, social policy, but personality, they're very different. And I think that that's also going to play out in terms of their foreign policy as well.
So I want to talk about the Reform Party led by Sir Nigel Farage. In a
Oh
recent
no, no,
polling,
no!
there were
He's not a sir. He's definitely not a sir. Don't say that. He's just a mister. So I'm not. Yeah. Anyway, please.
so in a recent polling, the Reform Party was poised to have taken over, to have gone ahead of the Conservative Party. So do you think
Yeah.
it's a real possibility, or is it just over exaggerated?
No, I don't think it's over exaggerated at all. I think Reform UK are. Well, there's a few things here. So I'm going to be transparent with your viewers that, I try to be relatively objective. Of course, I have my biases and opinions as everybody, but I'm going to be very blunt in this quick point, which is I really don't like Farage. I think he is a piece of, he's just a very despicable person who doesn't stand for what he preaches. So when Brexit happened, he didn't expect it to actually happen, right? Because he has had a career as an MEP in the parliament and he was earning a pretty decent wage, and he got to be, he got a lot of attention because he was the very vocal, hate you EU, you suck. He was very contrarian, provocative. And then it actually happened, and suddenly he's out of a job, and he's actually his actual purpose is gone. Sort of, you know what I mean, right? So he didn't actually want Brexit to happen. And so when it did, what did he do the next day? He went to go and get his German citizenship with his German wife. So this whole idea that he didn't want Brexit to, Brexit be free of connection to the EU, he then went and got a European passport because he realized that he still needs it for, to travel around the Schengen area and have all the benefits that we as European Brits did have when we were in the EU. So the hypocrisy of this man is unbelievable, and why I really have a very anti, and his comments over Ukraine in the past few days, very, very antipathy towards him. Anyway, that being said, yes, he is Reform are doing well. Reform is a slightly different party in that it's a private business. None of the members of the party get to actually influence the policies. Nigel Farage is the biggest shareholder. He literally owns 8 of the 15 shares. If you look it up on the government, on the government database, it's a publicly listed company, whatever, privately, it's a private company. So Reform is largely a vehicle for Nigel Farage's interests, and there is the belief amongst some that if the Conservatives were to be squeezed as badly as some polls say, either Farage could jump from Reform and join the Tory party and remold it in his image, so much more right wing. Because don't forget that so many of the senior cabinet ministers, or have been in recent years, are very right wing. Suena Braverman, Priti Patel, who else?
James Cleverly.
James is slightly different. James is a bit less. He's not as bad. He's actually a bit more moderate, I would say. Jacob Rees-Mogg, those types, right? The Boris Johnsons. They all love Farage, and I don't think that there would be anything better for them than to see Nigel Farage come in, become the leader of the Conservative Party, and take it more and firmly just as a right-wing party, not centre-right, but right, more like National Front or something, right? France. The alternative is there's a merge. Reform take so many seats, or the Conservatives lose so many seats that they need for their own survivability to continue to exist, to unite with the Labour Party, the Conservative Party. I don't know whether that would be the case, but the polls that I've seen, for Reform is on to win some seats. It varies quite significantly, but I don't think that that there are concerns that Reform could literally eat out so many seats of the Conservative Party versus some others that sort of they'll take a few but not that many. Most of the people who are voting no longer Tory are going to the Liberal Democrats or Labour, right? That's sort of the idea. But no, he will probably win Clacton. He will probably be an MP for the first time after 7 previous attempts. And Reform will be in government. What's dependent upon it is how badly the Tories are affected by the Labour and Liberal Democrats. How many other parties eat into the Conservatives' current set of seats that they control. So I think it's not just dependent on whether Reform consumes some of their seats, but also what happens with the other more, centre parties.
So, if the Conservative Party does end up becoming the number 2 party, who do you think will take over the mantle of leadership from Sunak? Is it going to be Suella Braverman, Robert Jenrick, or Priti Patel, or any other right-wing figure?
Yeah, so the Conservatives are going to lose. There's no question of that. And why I'm so, well, there's not really there's not really any, I think, surprise about that. And the reason why most people are very certain on that is because if you look at the rhetoric and the points that the Conservatives have been making in the past even week, it's shifted from we can win and lead your government still. It's how much of a majority do you want Labour to have? There's something called a supermajority, which is basically that the Labour Party could have anywhere from 430 to 470 seats, right? And the Conservatives could lose as much as, well, there is the potential that the Liberal Democrats would be the official opposition because they win 70 seats and the Conservatives win only 50 to 60, right? They are literally wiped out. And so what the Conservatives are trying to do now is argue to voters across the country, are you sure you want to give the Labour Party as big a majority as that? And basically damage limitation. And it seems to be relative to what they were doing before, which was absolutely terrible, dumpster fire. It seems to be working because you've got a potential that voters across the country will be like, oh, well, Labour's going to win. I might as well not bother voting. And so that might actually favour the Conservatives because they will limit or reduce the amount of seats that they overall lose. It is still bad. You've got not just campaigners, but candidates themselves, the actual people who are running for the office, going to their constituencies to drum up support, which is not really something you see the candidate doing. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, could lose his seat. It's absolutely disastrous for the Conservative Party, right? It could be the end of the Conservative Party, which is why the Reform bloc merge is a possibility, although I personally don't think it's going to happen. But they're going to lose. Sunak will leave because it's pretty clear he doesn't really care about it. He wants to move to California. He's a businessman. He's a tech guy, economics, finance. He's not a politician. He never was. And he's more unpopular than Liz Truss. That's how unpopular he is. He's hated. The only person who's hated more is Macron, but that's because of the French effect or voter effect. So anyway, I'm British. I've got to have a little stab at the French occasion. And he, he's going to leave. It is difficult to tell who would win, to be honest with you, a leadership contest with the Conservative Party. I think he would probably stick around to the point where, they've assessed whether or not a merger with Farage or Reform would happen. I don't think he wants that because he's more centre-right of the Conservatives, right? But he's had to pander to the right bloc because he needed them to stay in power. That's why he took on the Boris Johnson government's idea of the Rwanda policy. But it's been a complete... it's too funny how much of a disaster it has been. But anyway, so... I think someone like James Cleverly is quite well placed, actually. Jeremy Hunt, depending upon... You see, the problem is I don't know which seats are most at risk. But Jeremy Hunt is a veteran at this point, and he is one of the few remnants of what's known as the One Nation Tory, so much more centre-right. He could be well placed. There are people like Grant Shapps, the current, is it defenseman? Yeah, he is placing himself. Suella Braverman possibly, although she's so stupid, and I don't know whether she could drum up the same support. Priti Patel has been out of the picture a bit, but yeah, you could expect all of those people to be in the running. I know who I would prefer, but what I want versus what would more likely happen are two very different things. I think you'd see a handful of people varying from more centre-right One Nations like Jeremy Hunt to really far more right-leaning populist types like Braverman. And I think it would probably be somewhere in the middle. I think James Cleverly, Grant Shapps have good prospects if they even put their name in the hat or the hat in the ring.
So one last question before we end. So I want to ask your views about George Galloway and whether his candidates could have a dent on the Labour seats.
Oh, you mean the Workers' Party?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I mean, George Galloway is he's like Farage, but reasons, and he's quite different. I think the Workers' Party will be a sort of party that is there reminding or putting pressure on the Conservative, on the Labour left to do more for Israel and Gaza. That's their primary mandate. But no, I don't. There's no statistics anywhere, no poll I've seen where they get a seat at all. The British public just don't have an appetite for far left parties or more of that part of the spectrum. If you look at history, the Tories, the centre right, the right, whoever, have largely dominated the picture for much of time. And when the Labour Party have been in power, they've often been pretty centre right. Labour Party, Blair right. You can talk about the one in the 1960s, but yeah, I don't think so. George Galloway will always be like Farage in that sense of the face of the party, the person that really drives the whole thing. But are we going to see British people voting in large enough amount of numbers for representatives of the Workers' Party? No, we're not. They might get an MP, but that's it. They're a voice. They are a funnel by which to keep that pressure on, or on specific policy issues. Israel, Gaza being the most one. You might see a reasonable performance in certain constituents. So, as in, they might take votes away from Labour Party candidates where they run, but I don't think that'll be enough to actually win that local election. And where will that be? That will be in mainly Islamic-dominated regions or the areas. The reason why he won is because he ran in a very Islam, what's the word? Centric area. But are you going to see rural cities in rural countryside villages in East Anglia? No. So I think they're going to have a role in keeping the Labour Party on the straight and narrow. The one thing I will say is that the Labour Party have been very, very risk averse in this election. They've had very few gaffes. The one potential gaffe, which was Diane Abbott, they dealt with quickly and effectively, and allowed her to run. I personally think she is really dumb, but she was the first Black MP that this country's ever had, and she was a very strong symbol for many people from the Windrush scandal, the Jamaica, and other minority groups and so Sir Keir, whilst getting rid or gutting many of the left areas of factions of the Labour Party, hasn't completely sort of said no left-leaning people at all. And so that's going to, I think, play well with more left-leaning members of the British public who are like, well, he's done he's got rid of it, but he's also brought Diane well back into the frame. Yeah, I'm going to vote for Labour, not the Workers' Party. So I do think the Labour Party are going to really dominate, and I think they're doing a good job. if I'm honest, in the sense, not necessarily that I agree with everything that they're standing for, but I mean, if you purely from an objective sense, they are playing this election pretty well. And there's very few things that have gone wrong. The Conservatives have deliberately, I think in some ways, almost screwed up their entire campaign, and the developments with leaving D-Day early. It's like, what are you doing, Sunak? Like, it's like they want to destroy themselves. It's insane. So it's not so much that Labour have been doing everything right, as they've just been letting the Conservatives completely, do everything wrong. And I just don't think that any other party on another side of the spectrum can do anything. The Liberal Democrats, I think, will do relatively well because they're centre and they do appeal to certain voters on more progressive issues like the NHS, the environment. I used to like them. They were probably the party that I was more like, keen to consider. But well, now now we're not sure. So you could very well see a parliament made up of a massive amount of Labour MPs, a Liberal Democrat opposition, a Tory-Reform merger, and maybe some, Green or Worker Party MPs as well. We could see a completely, this could be the birth of a completely new political system in the UK. Political climate after 100 years of two main parties, right?